Okay, well, thank you. Well, welcome everybody to this this webinar on rotations for protected cropping. I'm Phil Sumption. I'm from the OGA, and the OGA are organising this webinar as part of a series partnership that some of you may have been to webinars that we've run before. But just a little bit of background about the programme. The webinar partnership is between the OGA, the CSA Network UK, and the Seed Sovereignty Programme run by the Gaia Foundation. And ourselves, and it's funded by Farming the Future, and they've been running these on a monthly basis ever since lockdown, and on the last Wednesday of the month. So we're coming towards the end of this cycle of programs. We don't quite know what will happen yet, but we hopefully will be able to continue next year. The purpose of the webinar program is to focus on practical teaching and farmer-to-farmer knowledge exchange from farmers and growers around the UK and beyond. And it's designed to increase knowledge exchange and learning on both the politics and practice of agroecology, seed sovereignty and food sovereignty. So that's the preamble. We're here tonight because we're interested in protected cropping and particularly rotations, and that's a subject that is I think it's really important. Rotations, I mean, yes, there are debates about whether you can run systems without rotations and how the microbial communities adapt, but it's a central tenet of organic farming, and at the moment it's the best tool we have for a lot of things in terms of managing weeds and pests and diseases and soil health. So, but it's not always easy to do in tunnels and glass houses where you have a big pressure to focus on a certain small range of kind of economic crops. So, which is why I'm delighted to be running this and to have two extremely experienced growers here tonight. And I think we're going to start with, we've got Andy Dibbin from Abbey Home Farm, who will come on later. We'll start with Pete. First of all, just a few bits of housekeeping, just to say that if you have questions to the panelists, please put them in the Q&A box, and we'll deal with them there. If you want to generally chat about between yourselves or have comments, then or links or things you want to put in, then please put that in the chat. But we will try and sort of focus on the Q&A, and we'll run probably I think unless there are any burning points of clarification, we'll probably run the two talks together, which will probably be about sort of 50-55 minutes, and then we'll have questions. So I think that without further ado, I'll hand over to Pete, who will introduce himself as well. You're on mute, Pete.
Hi, yeah. I'm Pete Dollymore and worked for 17, 18 years growing at Hankham Organics with Miles Denyer. And we had an acre and a half of glass, which we got up and running from a derelict state, and then took on 2.5 acre field at the back and ran a bot scheme that pretty quickly got to about 500 and hovered around 500 to 600 for the best part of 12 years that I was working there. And then I have now recently moved to, well, I say recently, it still feels quite recent. 6 years ago, moved to working for a school where I'm running a 1 acre wall garden with a bunch of teenagers, and I'm enjoying it. That's the main reason for the move. Sort of a bit of downsizing, a chance to try different things and get more into beekeeping and woodland management, a bit of diversity. Still work at Hankham, helping keep their venting and irrigation systems running, and some things. So yeah, that's me. Are you going through introductions first, or am I going straight onto the presentation? I think you're still muted.
Yeah, I think maybe. Oh, well, okay. Briefly, Andy, do you want to just introduce yourself first, and then we'll go into Pete's talk?
Yeah, cool. Hi, I'm Andy, Andy Dibben. I'm head grower at Abbey Home Farm near Cirencester in Gloucestershire. And I've been here for 8 years, but I've been in organic veg for about 15. And yeah, I've got increasing amounts of experience with protected cropping for this webinar. I obviously done a lot of polytunnel growing, but 3 years ago, we put up 1,000 meters squared of glass. So I've just redesigned all my protected cropping rotations to account for this and take it in hand with the polytunnels. So yeah, that'll be informing my presentation tonight.
Great. So let me just share my screen and I'll move on with my brief presentation. So what I'm going to try and do is outline a few basics, which is kind of like how I like to do things, and then go into more details as we move along. As I said, I worked at Hankham Organics, and that was predominantly protected cropping. And now at the Montessori Place, as I'm such a fan of protected cropping, I'm continuing to sort of mess around with it there with polytunnel and caterpillar tunnels or temporary tunnels, Spanish tunnels. So the outline of this presentation will basically be why should we be rotating crops, and it's not usually such a big deal in glass houses as outdoors, but I think recently it's become much more of a hot topic as we try to fine-tune our systems. Can I look a bit at the organic standards, because for most people who are certified, there are outlines there that we try to follow, and for all sorts of reasons, those standards have been developed over a very long time by most of the most influential people in the country, if not the world, making those standards what they are. So they're important to look at. The design templates that we'll look at will be just really my own way of getting my head around rotations, because you're working in space and time, and it's good to have a way of creating some kind of mind map and then getting that onto paper. So everybody's got their own way of thinking about it. So I'll just run a few different ones of those, and then moving on to examples of rotations and what they might mean in principle, but then often practice is a very different thing. It's all very well starting with a plan, but then often nature and people and markets and weather have very different ideas. And then I'll finish off just looking at what our challenges are and where perhaps innovation needs to keep happening into the future. So why do we rotate? I mean, the essential reason is to avoid monocropping, which traditionally has created problems for people, both in the modern era and in the past. I think trial and error probably is how people have been growing vegetables, and how agriculture has developed. And as far back as the Egyptian times, there's evidence that they rotated their crops all the way up to the Middle Ages. And the first time I came across the concept of crop rotation was watching the young ones as a kid. And I actually shared the video with Andy and Phil of Rick and Neil on the train trying to revise for a university challenge, talking about crop rotation in the 14th century. So I can recommend anybody look that up and watch it. But I think for copyright reasons, I probably can't play it now. But obviously back then they were using basic 2-year or 2-field, 3-field, 4-field systems where they were strip cropping, and found that by moving around livestock, vegetable cropping, having lay periods, rest periods, different crops, they managed to avoid a lot of problems that they would otherwise get. More recently, science has kind of stepped into it, but we could say that in the middle of last century, the way that science was heading, sort of chemical science, meant that people were able to monocrop, and that it was being propped up by chemical fertilizers, pesticides, herbicides. But over time, I think people have come to realize that's not the way to go. Having a fertility building phase is very important in organic agriculture, and in glass houses it's difficult to justify that because they're an expensive use of space and often very labor intensive. So yeah, growing a load of clover in a greenhouse is difficult to justify. Obviously over time we're reducing pest disease and disorder. A lot of it is about avoiding things building up, and I think everyone's familiar with the concept of trying to kind of trick the pests and the diseases a bit. But also if you can design intelligently, you may find that you can actually improve your soil through the rotation and therefore avoid fertility problems, soil structure problems. There's efficiencies to be gained on the farm, despite the downsides of perhaps when you have a structure or you've put in kind of specialization that you wouldn't necessarily want to keep changing things. You've got a glass house and you're growing good tomatoes. Or if you have, on a small scale, maybe people set up nice strong bean structure and then you've got to move it the next year. So it's not always efficient, but generally speaking, we're getting plants to do the work for us. So once you've got a rotation, you get it working, and it's far more efficient. And the last point I would make really is that we're usually working with annuals and biennials in this type of horticulture when you're rotating, if it's not perennials, if you're not growing fruit. So what is it about annuals and biennials that makes rotation work for us? And I just want to sort of go back to this ecological principles. I've kind of learned this when I did my environmental science degree, that there's a sort of climax community of plants that's reached in most natural communities, most ecosystems. Mature trees and sort of understory, obviously in the tropics, that's a tropical rainforest, but there would have been temperate rainforests in these parts of the world. And there would have been regular catastrophic events, which would include trees falling down, fires, volcanoes, landslides, floods. So there's always a point when nature has to kind of start again. And we're really working with those pioneer species that would have come in. Most of the weeds that we get in our systems, and most of the crops that we grow have been bred from original wild cousins that would have been these pioneer species. This is just really an example of what is happening in those ecosystems. I had to draw it myself because, again, I wasn't sure about copyright and nicking things off the internet. I've been caught out like that before. But you got to throw in as well the large herbivores, because they will keep often those pioneer species down and make it more difficult for the ecosystem to sort of make its way back to the climax species, and that's where we get the richness of environments that we see around us. So if I would sort of divide it, I know it's maybe controversial dividing things into nature and human, but it's for the sake of clarity. I'm going to just look at some key elements around natural succession. And what you would find in nature is that legumes and crops that retain nutrients in the soil or in their biomass are an important part of recovering from a catastrophic event. That the root structure, soil structure, this is what helps build the soil that later goes on to provide such a richness. The organic matter, the soil microbiome, all of these are developing from what would have been in primary succession, which is where the sort of rock gets turned into soil, then becomes a kind of getting set back to bare soil and then rebuilding again. And so you get this gradual progression to greater biomass, more complexity, more layered systems, and the species that are in there will be appropriate to the environment, appropriate to the season, and they fill an ecological niche. And so when we're looking at our systems, we're sort of taking this template of how things are developing. We're knocking back the weeds, selecting for the things we want, but remembering where it's all coming from is so important. That we're not trying to sort of dominate it. We're trying to plug into the work that nature's doing there. But of course, we're trying to make a living, trying to sort of live on our farms, create a livelihood. I'm going to avoid the word sort of profit and money, because I think that perhaps as a society we need to sort of move on from some of those things, but you can sort of translate backwards and forwards for that. We want our system to be efficient, we want them to be productive, and that if we can actually utilize rotations to help us with that, then it's good. We don't want to make life difficult for ourselves by creating rotations that just have a lot of work, a lot of headache, and aren't growing crops that we want. So I just want to be clear about that. We're not here to sort of preach, you know, you should be doing this and you should be doing that. Everything's going to be different for everybody in different situations. And what we want to do is grow crops well. We want to provide food for people. We want to sell food to people, and we want to be working within our holdings to make things work for the people who work there and the families that live there. We want to be working for our community. One of the great things about rotating crops is that diversity is on your side. So the more different crops you have, the more you can rotate, the more variation you get. But if you haven't got a local market, then it's difficult to justify all that diversity. If you're supplying a wholesale market to sort of a national wholesaler, then you really want to be specializing in a few big crops, and so it's much easier if you're supplying a local market, supplying a local community, to get variety in, especially in your protected cropping areas. And we're working within organic principles, which should be in line with what we're trying to achieve, both as farms, growers, and as custodians and stewards of the land. So, quick look at the organic standards. I just want to make it really clear that, you know, the Soil Association and other certification bodies seem to get a bit of a knocking sometimes, and the word organic is sometimes avoided in preference to sort of regenerative or natural. But these certification bodies have been doing a lot of the hard work for so many years, and we mustn't put that aside and try and reinvent the wheel. And that's not to say they're the be all and end all, and a lot of people can't afford certification, and you know, that's a different issue. But the set of standards we've got are extremely well honed and should be respected, I think. So I'm not going to read through all of this, but if you want to go to section 2.4.1 in the Soil Association standards, most recent edition, it's online. The highlight really there is that we're nourishing our soil ecosystems through varied crop rotation, through legumes and through green manure crops, and the application of manure or organic material as well. And we should be looking to build and maintain soil health and maximize efficiencies. There's a few more links here that I've put from the Soil Association specifically on protected cropping. So hopefully that can be available for people if you want to check back. So taking the key elements 1 and 2, sort of natural elements, human elements, where do they meet in terms of protected cropping? Perhaps of less concern for protected systems is soil erosion, because well, the last few weeks have been quite wet, certainly down here. Don't know about for everyone else. If you've got good ground cover, you're not going to lose as much soil. Even if you're not losing soil as such, being washed off, you're going to be losing soil structure. In a glass house with polytunnel, that's not such a big issue. Nutrient retention, again, you're often trying to prevent leaching of nutrients out of your soil. Again, in protected systems, it's not such an issue unless you're overwatering. And building organic matter, perhaps it could be argued that's also not as important, because when you're growing on a larger scale, you can't be putting heaps of compost everywhere. Most people are probably putting too much compost in their polytunnels and their greenhouses. And so building organic matter is probably not the chief reason that you would use green manures or be looking at to do that with rotating your crops. There are arguments around what do we mean by organic matter, because there's humus versus just raw dead stuff, but perhaps that's something for a different discussion. So what are we concerned with in protected cropping? We're going to be concerned with functional ecological diversity. building the soil microbiome, getting resilience into our soil and improving our soil structure. We want to avoid pests, diseases becoming established. We want to be improving our nitrogen fixing if we can. But rarely do people grow enough beans to fix the nitrogen they need. And even if they do, they're probably picking it all as beans. And then we want to be reducing, comes into the same thing, reducing reliance on bought-in inputs. So can we make efficient use of our crop waste rather than buying in PAS 100 compost or chicken pellets or fertilizers or whatever it might be. And then we want to be efficiently using the space. It's probably the most valuable space on the holding in terms of the output, and it's very labor intensive, and we need to water it. So we want to be using that area efficiently. So looking at some design tools, on the side there is an example of 1 month in the glasshouse at Hankham in April. And conveniently, it fitted on an A4 sheet. That's really like a bird's eye view of the glasshouse, but it's also a table. And you can see all the bed. Each of those beds is 50 square meters. It's 25 meters long and 2 meters wide. And that's all the crops that would be in there in April, and in bold are the things that are being planted at that time. And the other stuff will either have been overwintered or planted in March, perhaps February. And so you can see the variety of stuff we were growing. At this time of year, like April's really key, because if you've got protected areas, your key time really is the hungry gap. You know, it could be said that winter's important as well if you want to be growing salads and stuff, but there's often a lot of stored veg in the winter from the fields. Obviously, the Mediterranean types of salad fruits, tomatoes, cucumbers, peppers and things are great in the summer, but often they're not the most profitable of things to grow, and they're very labor intensive. The time that you probably can capitalize most in terms of benefit to your protected cropping system, to yourself and also to your customers, is to try and fill that hungry gap as best as possible. And so really looking at that in the rotation can be very helpful. The way my mind works, I don't know about anybody else, and we all kind of have pictures in our heads, I think. When I think about rotations, I actually think more of like a clock. And I think about the year, I picture a kind of dial. And so I've tended to use this quite a lot for conceptualizing things. And so the blue line down the middle is the winter and the summer solstice. The season is kind of offset from that because it starts later and it finishes later. Often the sun comes out in March and everyone rushes down the garden centre, and it's too early. Really, things don't get going until we get into late April, May. And and then they often will go late. You know, if you have a mild autumn like we're having now, your stuff can still be looking good. But I've still got basil outside. I took the cover off a caterpillar tunnel, and we've still got basil that we're picking, exposed to the elements. It's not looking brilliant, but still tastes good. So drawing yourself up something like this that suits your particular situation can be helpful. Just to give you clues of when you're looking at starting your sowing, planting, what your hardy things, your tender things. And sometimes we need those deadlines. And if you've got that mapped out, then that can be helpful. And you can make them more specific. So this is for the school. I had to shift a lot of the way I planted things because I didn't want to be doing too much work in the summer holidays when nobody's there. And the idea of not doing much work in August for a grower is pretty bonkers. But we actually found at Hankham a lot of people go on holiday, staff and customers. And, you know, it's quite a nice way of avoiding burnout is to actually go, do you know what, there's loads of stuff around, like everyone's coming out the woodwork selling their produce in August. All the farmers markets are flooded with stuff. Let's take the foot off the gas. And I've taken that to a bit of an extreme with the school. And this is one way I've kind of mapped that out in my mind. Going back a bit to the map of the glasshouse, the table that was there, this is a more simple version. This is the school polytunnel. And again, the key to this is that I have one of these for every month, and that each crop in that month is listed. If it's coming in and it's new, it goes in bold. I will date it as well, but obviously this is a sort of generic one, and sometimes even write down who set the bed up, as much information as possible. But certainly putting in any input. So both of these beds here, the melon and the cucumber melon in June, had 1 wheelbarrow of compost, and that was it, apart from the seed and the plants that went in. The little asterisks are for non-organic seed. So you can see what the sort of crops we had, and then as we move to July, August, September, that will change, and then over the year you have 12 of these, one for every month. Certification officer's very happy with that, and you have a good, if you've put dates in and any notes about the condition of the crops, then you get a really good build up. And one of the keys, I think, like we talk a lot about rotation in terms of planning ahead, but without having be able to look back and see what you've done, there's not a lot of benefit to planning ahead too much. So keeping records is so important. Looking at how do your crops grow in your situation, what works well, what doesn't, how long are things generally in the ground for, and it can change. Like if you plant Mizuna in August in a polytunnel, sometimes in one year it will do well, another year it just gets ripped to shreds by flea beetle, another year it's kind of by the end of September it's had cabbage root fly and it's all dying. Every year is different, so you can sort of build up an average of what you feel is going to work. And then getting a bit more complicated. So the way that this works, again, this is from Hankham, is that I put in a rotation. So I've got my sort of basic rotation, and number 9 is like the year of the rotation. And then the WME is west, middle, east, west, middle, east. So there's 3 bays of the glass house here with west bed, middle bed, east bed. They're all in rotation 9, and they're in different locations around the glass house. And then along the top is what the rotation it should have. So this is a particularly complicated part of the rotation. And so I've used it here as an example of where you can get in really into the nitty gritty. And then you're putting in, now in reality, I would just write this in with a pen or a pencil, but I've typed it in for the sake of this presentation. I wouldn't normally bother doing that. But you can see there the variety of things we're growing, and the idea is to just keep changing the types of crops, and sort of follow on is very important. You're trying to fit as much as you can in, and so with good planning and knowledge of your crop life cycle and what works at what times of year, then you always get beds that are blank for a bit or things that have gone to seed, but I'll talk a bit about that later because that's not always such a problem, but we're trying to be as efficient as we can. So you can see here that any given bed will run all the way through, and then by the next year it will have moved on to another one, and there'll be several of these which I just have pinned up on the wall near the desk that I used to use for doing my tiny amount of desk work. And then we just fill that out, and sometimes it would be very last minute, as long as you're sticking to the rotation plan, and other times it might be 3 years ahead. So that was looking at some sort of design tools, if you like. But the basic principles that you're looking at with these rotations is knowledge of crops, timings, keep records, and try and keep one following on from the other in a protected system. Try to incorporate nitrogen fixing green manures, and look at the rotation in a moment, and we'll see where they fit in. Flowering plants, you can plant specific plants to do a good job of supplying nectar for your beneficials, or a lot of crops, if they're just let go to seed, do a really good job. Coriander, basil, rocket, most of the brassicas, dill, all of these, if they were let go to seed, really good attractors and nectar suppliers. I've put increased time between recurring X, Y, and Z. I don't want to get too teacher-like here, but X, Y, and Z could be anything. And in my case at Hankham was cucumbers and brassicas. Wanted to try and increase the amount of space between those crops because we wanted to grow more and more brassicas, and it was getting more and more difficult to keep a good gap between them. And I imagine for a lot of people it's the same. And cucumbers were just abysmal. We had years where we would pick 2 off each plant, and then it would go down with verticillium wilt. And so increasing the amount of space between those crops is really important. And within a standardized method, it's all about efficiency. Like if you can have a standard method that you're using, a bed system, sizes of beds, sets of irrigation that fit all your beds, then within that you create the diversity. Then you're onto a good thing. You can, create less work for yourself and boost the sort of energy and productivity of your system in that respect. But it's got to be practical, it's got to be workable. And then last of all, just things like shade, your irrigation system, what sort of moisture management do things need? Are you putting them next to each other? Workflow and access to the crop. Sometimes people start off very enthusiastically planting all their tomatoes, cucumbers, peppers all in one tunnel, and then you try and get in there to pick stuff, especially courgettes, can be a complete nightmare and scratch to pieces. So these are worth considering as well. So here's a rotation. How am I doing for time, Phil? Cool. So the Hankham, we had a 10-year rotation, but it was effectively 2 5-year rotations that were both slightly tweaked. And they'd start off with a summer clover crop, and they'd be followed by 2 sort of big summer crops, cucurbits, courgettes, tomatoes, peppers, aubergines, those sort of things. And then in and around that, there'd be all the little fiddly things that we'd grow 1 bed of, 2 beds of, or we'd want succession, like salad crops or spinach. And so those are the sort of cornerstones, the first 3 years, starting with the clover, and then the other things fitting around it. And here's the other of the 5-year. And so, anyone's welcome to pick over that and take anything off it that you will. And looking back, we established this rotation in about 2010, and I don't think they're sticking to it now. It's changed, a lot of things have changed there, and they've gone no dig, which I think is great because I've actually done the same at the school, not strictly, but trying to head that way. That's a whole nother argument about how we treat our soils, but this worked pretty well, and I actually saw cucumber crops improving over the time. We still had problems, but we were able to grow some pretty good cucumbers, and it was incredibly efficient. We really churned out a lot of stuff while adding in a green manure. So here it gets a bit more pretty now. You'll be pleased to hear. So there's courgettes in May 2011 with tomatoes behind them. We trained the courgettes up this bamboo structure to try and make access easier and picking easier. There's a little overview of the glass house, top left. That's 5,000 square meters. And some idea of the diversity of crops, classic tomatoes and beans, salads, kales, and even bunched carrots, early carrots, which always did pretty well. We've tried to increase, you can't really have enough things flowering. Obviously you don't want just to have it full of nice flowers and no crops, but the more nectar that's there, the more continuity of nectar that's available, the more you're just helping all those beneficial insects keep going, keep breeding. They always have the energy, and you're attracting in things from outside, and then they fly back outside again. Trying to have the greenhouse as like this porous thing that things can come in and out of, and keeping the vents open to allow that is quite important. and this kind of patchwork of cropping, so that if something does get a problem, it's not just spreading through the glass house. It's, you know, encounters a different crop as soon as it tries to move. And then, you know, is a good one, the sugar snap peas, beans, you know, getting some legumes in, which I think in the case of a crop is kind of nitrogen neutral as opposed to nitrogen positive, if you like. But then most of the stuff we're growing is nitrogen negative. So it's like, you know, lifting nitrogen up into the leaves, they're being chopped, they're being put in boxes and bags and sent away. And how's that getting back? That's always the question. Looking still at like diversity, we've got some limnanthus poached eggplant in amongst spring greens. They get sown at the same time in the autumn, planted with the spring greens, maybe 1 to every 50 spring greens, and then they flower just when the cabbage aphid is starting to sniff around, and they attract hoverfly in, and hoverfly are a great sort of ally of particularly cabbages. Lacewing, really early, like flowering of tatsoi, and the lacewings are out feeding on that nectar, getting ready to lay their eggs amongst the aphid colonies. And coriander, which is such a great winter crop, just allowed to flower, and you just stand there for, take 30 seconds out of your busy schedule, just stand there and think, just coriander flower, and then you see one insect, another insect, and before you know it, it's like you realize it's heaving with stuff. It's a very humbling experience. The green manures, just a quick one on the clover. We tended to go for sweet clover, crimson clover mix, and then if I could, I would try and sow phacelia and buckwheat into it once it was established, and then flail mowed and cultivated in, and then ready to start again. And there were a lot of nitrogen nodules on those roots. We started off using inoculants with it, but then down the line wasn't really necessary. So there it's sown just with an earthway seeder into rows. Once it's sort of got established, scatter some phacelia and buckwheat into it and go through with the hoe just to knock back the weeds. And then it's getting quite good by 7 weeks, and by 10 weeks, wasn't always this good, but we had some crops that were, you know, 3 foot high, 3 foot deep. And that was actually too big, because then the flail mower's struggling a bit to get through it. At the school, I'm using a lot of caterpillar tunnels, partly because we haven't got the lovely big glass house, but also that's a real game changer for rotations. You know, you can lock into your outside rotations, and there's been a lot of technology around moving polytunnels, moving glass houses. These aren't so great in the winter, especially in a windy spot, but particularly for early crops, we can get, you know, kale, spring greens, Swiss chard, salads getting going much earlier with the help of a caterpillar tunnel. And you can actually take the cover off if you get a bit of wind early in the year. The crops don't mind it too much, and then just put the cover back on when the wind's gone. They're looking for an average increase in temperature. And then cucumbers. I'm trying to not grow cucumbers in the polytunnel. I'm trying to just grow them in the caterpillar tunnel, and that's relying on a wire running down the middle of the top of the hoops. And not only does that provide the cucumbers with something to hook onto, but it also improves the stability of the tunnel. Their schoolwork. Those kids, they don't know how lucky they got it. So the last thing I just want to say really where I feel we're going with it at the moment. So what's the kind of work to do? We need to improve green manures. I haven't talked about undersowing. Andy's going to talk about some more stuff, so it'd be really great to hear what he's going to be telling us he's up to at Abbey Farm. The domination of winter brassicas is a bit of a problem because they're such a great crop. Summer solanaceae and cucurbitaceae, so tomatoes and cucumbers, peppers and aubergines. If you've only got a little polytunnel and you want to get as many of those in, yeah, how are you going to avoid building up problems? Nematodes, verticillium wilt. We would want to reduce our over-reliance on bought-in inputs, and so hopefully by designing good rotations we can do that. Crop diversity, I think that's down to local markets, so hopefully there's improvement in that. And traditionally the big commercial glasshouses really were struggling. I mean, if you'd speak to them and they'd say, oh, we've managed to like slip a cucumber crop into our tomato program, and you'd be like, wow, that's as good as your rotation gets. It's a different world, you know. I think they're getting better, and some of them have gone like in monocropping in a very high-tech way, and some of them are doing very well, like white salads, and others are just rotating, maybe a 3-year rotation. Managing complexity is always an issue. So when you're trying to plan a rotation, if you've got a lot of crops, you don't want it to become a headache. So trying to keep the system simple. And then I think filling the hungry gap, especially as we move into more food insecurity, climate change. You know, we really need to get cropping year round. We need to be feeding people, and protected cropping's going to be the way we're going to have to do it, really. So aside from all the sort of structures and the energy and all that stuff, the planning and making sure that we're getting carbohydrate crops as well as nutritional crops that we can eat in the spring, maybe root vegetables and things, early potatoes, early carrots, early onions. How we go about doing that profitably is a challenge. So thank you for listening, and just thanks to all these people who, like, without whose support and advice over years, my knowledge and the direction that I took with stuff would not have been the same. Yeah, they know who they are. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Pete. That's really, really inspiring, and you know, it's always been inspiring to see to come to Hancombe and see the work you've done there, and good to see it continuing at Montessori. So thank you very much. I'm going to leave any questions till the end. I think we'll go straight to Andy now. So make sure he has enough opportunity to say what he wants to say before we do questions. So thanks, Andy.
Cool. Hi everyone, just get my screen up. Bit of patience, so my computer's a bit slow. Okay. Can you hear that loud and clear? Cool. Okay, evening everybody. Like I said earlier, my name's Andy Dibben. I am head grower at Abbey Home Farm near Cirencester in Gloucestershire. We are a very big organic farm, so it's 660 hectares, been certified organic for 30 years. Luckily, I just have to look after 6 hectares, which is very manageable compared to 660. Slightly different to Pete's setup. I've got field scale, market garden, polytunnels and glasshouse. What defines my protected cropping system really is my route to market. So I think a lot of what Pete was doing was to a box scheme. All of the crops we grow on farm, or I wholesale a tiny bit of gluts off farm if needs be, and we buy in stuff if we need to be. But ideally, we are a one-stop shop for UK crops 12 months of the year. So we try and supply as many different crops for as long a season as possible to our customer base, so they can just buy local and organic veg from our shop. Because of that, we use our polytunnels and our glasshouses in a slightly different way to a lot of people use them. So if you run a box scheme, you might need 12, 20 crops ready each week. We very rarely go below 30, 35 crop lines a week, and we'll go up to around about 80 crop lines a week. So, and the big difference there being with box scheme, you define what the customers are eating each week. With retail, it's completely the opposite. You just have to react to what your customers want each week, and you need to give them a choice, which to a grower is either a complete nightmare or it's an intellectual challenge, depending on what mood you're in. So yeah, I'll come back onto that route to market and how it defines what I grow later on. But just an overview of the key functions of crop rotation for me are manage soil health and fertility, manage weeds, disrupt pest and disease, maximize efficient use of critically valuable space for full 12 months of the year, and implement integrated pest management strategies. So all of the ones I just mentioned are absolutely key techniques for me all the time, basically. The next few are options for rotation. They're not ones that I use so much in my protected cropping. So resting the land. So if I was talking about my outside rotations, there's a lot of resting land. In fact, in some areas, it's almost 60% cropping, 30% resting land. Allow for alternate seasonal uses. So I'll come on to that in a little bit. I don't do this, but it's very important if you've got limited protected cropping or limited dry space, should I say. Integrating livestock. Again, I don't do this in my protected cropping. We do it outside, but I've seen really good examples of integrating livestock and protected cropping. I think one of the people was actually here this evening. And then the last thing, rotations for me are the absolute starting point for all of my crop planning, basically. The starting point is I have my rotation and then I build everything on top of that, basically. And I think possibly the most, I mean, Phil touched on whether there are systems which probably quite healthily for the soil don't rely on rotations. You know, you could argue that nature doesn't do rotation, or if it does it on a very, very long time scale. So I would match that. I use rotations. I don't think they're 100% essential. If you've got an amazingly symbiotic natural system, I don't. And actually, even more importantly, inside of protected cropping, it's very hard to mimic natural systems because you've put a wall up around your system, essentially. So the key thing for me is rotations allow me to blend all of the above into a systems approach. So all those things listed above, I don't have single plans for all of these different things. They all blend together, and rotations is the best way of using all these different sustainable growing techniques, but kind of blending them into one system. So to me, it's not an essential, it's just an amazing tool for doing all of the above, basically. So to start with, managing soil health and fertility. So yeah, I mean, I have a very different attitude to this inside my protected cropping and in my outside growing areas. In my outside growing areas, I tend to put in a big fertility building period, all with cover crops outside. I use no compost outside, it's all cover crops. But I'll do a big 2-year or 3-year fertility build, and then I'll crop for 5 or 4 years, depending on which areas it is. And then I'll do more fertility building and then crop again for a few years. Because your protected cropping space is so valuable, and I mean, it's valuable at all times of year. Perhaps, I mean, I would second what Pete said. In fact, you see that Pete did a lot of his fertility building in the summer. I agree also that I actually think tomatoes, peppers, cucumbers, they're great crops. They look financially profitable, but if you look at the actual mechanics financially, they're not the most profitable. Definitely for me as a retailer, polytunnels and glasshouse, their most important role is autumn, winter and spring. And that is definitely when they earn me my most money and keep my customers well fed, healthy and interested in my shop for most of the year. Well, it's not my shop, but our shop. As far as managing soil health and fertility in glasshouse and polytunnels, then, for me, it's less of a question of dumping a load of fertility at the beginning of a rotation and then letting it slowly be eaten up by the crops and then topping it up again 5 years later. For me, it's a bit more of a constant just topping it up when I've got a hungry crop. I only use composts in glasshouse and polytunnel and a few very select outdoor crops like fennel and celery. But outside, like I said, it's all cover crop based. We tend to do our compost feeding on Solanaceae, and then we normally have at least 1 or 2 years of other cropping after that. And we in the polytunnels that are fairly healthy, good soil health, well managed for 20 years organically now. It's just about topping up that fertility every now and then. It's not putting a huge hit in because we've exhausted it. It's just constantly topping it up. So we tend to add a good amount of compost in the polytunnels maybe once every 3 years and then let the crops feed through that. A really important thing to note about compost use is it doesn't rain very much in polytunnels and glass houses, nothing like it does outside. So you don't get anything like the nitrogen leaching that you would get outside. And in fact, it's very, very easy to go over the top with compost inside polytunnels and glass houses. And too much nitrogen is a bad thing wherever you are. Too much nitrogen inside a glass house or a polytunnel is real trouble. One of the biggest challenges inside is insect pests. One of the things that insect pests love is over nitrogen fed lush green crops. It can also affect your flowering. If you're growing tomatoes, peppers, cucumbers, and you've got way too much nitrogen, if you're putting compost down every year, you'll end up with too much nitrogen. And then you'll end up with very vegetative crops that don't flower as much as you want them to. They'll be all leaf, no flower. So you want a nice balanced nitrogen cycle in your glass houses. So you don't want to be adding compost all the time. So we add compost a little bit every few years, but the mainstay of my fertility and soil health management outside and also inside is still green manures. I'm a massive fan. They do all the jobs you want. They're cheaper. If you're buying in your compost, green manure seeds are a lot cheaper than compost. So it's quick that way. You don't have to cart it around. You just sow it and it does the job for you. Traditionally, the way I do green manures outside is doing, when I'm not cropping, I'll grow mixed clovers, grasses, herbs, annuals, and probably like 8 or 9 different species in a mix. And I'll grow that for 2 or 3 years and then crop for 4 or 5 years after that. Again, limited space in polytunnels and glass houses. Trying to take stuff out of production for long periods of time doesn't necessarily make financial sense. So a key technique for using green manures in limited areas like protected cropping is undersowing crops. So the way we do this, and tomatoes is a really good example. So the way we do this with tomatoes is literally the same point as we plant the tomatoes. We undersow them with a clover and a trefoil. We then overhead the tomatoes 2 or 3 times, and that is enough, probably over the space of, like, depending on how hot it is, over the space of 2 to 3 weeks, and that tends to be enough to get the green manure established. And then we switch to drip line, and the clover does great. It can access that drip line water for the rest of the season. And something we're working on more and more now with our rotations in the polytunnels and the glass houses is actually not making this just an annual event where we undersow tomatoes and then we work it in and we put a crop in afterwards. What we're actually looking to do now is something called zone tillage or strip tillage, where we undersow the tomatoes, but we keep them weeded directly underneath the crop, just in a sort of 30-centimetre line. And then we can plant straight into that after the tomatoes. So we're doing this quite a lot now with strawberries, which I'll come on to a little bit. We've done it with early calabrese in the tunnels. The problem with zone tillage, it doesn't really work. The way it doesn't work in polytunnels, it doesn't work with all your multi-sown salad crops in the winter and your spinach crops and stuff like that. It's good for the bigger plants like beans and brassicas and tomatoes, peppers. And most of our crops in the summer are undersown. And then, okay, so next slide. So managing weeds. So rotations are really sort of simple way of managing weeds without thinking about it too much. And the way that works is all the different crop families, you plant them, they establish at different times of year. They all have different growing habits. So you have different techniques for weeding them. So, crops like tomatoes, peppers, courgettes, things like that are very, very easy to weed early on. You can get on top of annual weed problems quite quickly. The way we do that is we give them a few good weeds and then we undersow them, or we undersow them straight away. And that way the undersowing of green manures outcompetes the weeds. We also, so that there's obviously the really easy to weed. Generally the summer crops are very easy to weed. And you hope by mixing up your crop families and weeding them all at different times, that when you get round in your rotation to growing a very weed susceptible crop, such as carrots, which we grow a lot of carrots inside to keep our continuous supply going, you don't want to be coming out of a really weedy crop, turning it over in the space of a day and sowing carrots straight away. So we always build into our rotations, we build time ahead of our carrots to stale seed bed the carrots. So to set up the beds, put a load of water on them, let them flush with weeds, give them a flame weed, and then drill carrots. And then we flame weed them again just before the carrots germinate. So that's your annual weeds. Perennial weeds. So depending on how big your tunnels are, I've got nice narrow, lots of nice narrow tunnels, which it's nice. You can manage them in different ways climatically, but it does mean you have the edge effect and perennial weeds creeping in from the sides. So, and again, you know, the holding where I work is quite old now. It's been cropped for 25 years. I think the polytunnel has been cropped for about 22 years. So there is a fair bit of ingression from perennial weeds. I've got two tactics for dealing with perennial weeds. It's the same tactics inside and outside, and that's either grow a crop of potatoes, which is not great for soil health because you essentially pick up the whole tunnel, shake it around and drop it back on the floor. It's very good at dealing with perennial weeds. And then if it really gets out of control, and in the market garden, we're doing this now, we've actually built this into the rotation in the market garden, which is if we get a plot in the market garden where the weeds get really bad, normally cooch, we actually put it down to strawberries for 4 or 5 years. It's the only time anywhere on the farm that I grow stuff through black plastic. And I'm using the black plastic to kill the cooch, and I'm growing the strawberries in the black plastic to earn me money while I'm killing the cooch. So it's quite a good tactic. And again, you can use that if your tunnels get out of hand or your glasshouse gets out of hand, you can build that into your rotation, having not necessarily strawberries, but having crops going through black plastic for 12 months will kill off most cooch basically, and then take the black plastic off again. The other key thing about crop rotation is disrupting pest and disease. And the thing that's really important here, which not many people know, is like there's some obvious like crop specific diseases. Top left, you've got blight there on tomatoes. Everyone knows blight affects Solanaceae. Bottom right, we've got carrot fly. Obviously, everyone knows carrot fly affects carrots, but it also can affect the rest of the umbellifer family. So we don't necessarily get it on parsnips, but we've had it on parsley, we've had it on celery, and we've had it on fennel, all of which have been damaged commercially by carrot fly. So that's a family-specific pest. They won't attack brassicas. But the other two, I mean, mildew's the one that, you know, there's a lot of mildews that are very crop specific. Although you can get powdery mildew on lots of different crops, there are actually different species of mildew that affect the different crops. Same with aphids. You tend to have, you'll have generalist aphids, but you also have aphids that will specialize in predating on certain crop families or a number of crop families. So by just physically moving your crop every year in geographical space, you are combating these problems. It's important to realize that many of these can persist in the soil or in the local area. So even if you have a break and then plant the crop in the same place, you can still pick up these pest problems. So just geographically moving will disrupt those. Okay, so maximize efficient use of valuable space, 12 months. So this, for me, this is really the really kind of complicated bit of my crop planning and my rotations. And that is, I'm trying to produce carrots 12 months of the year. And the way that works for me is the first crops of carrots, which are already, I've sown them about a month ago. So the first crops of the year of fresh carrots of the year will come in about March in the glass house. And that'll be from overwintered carrots. We then go into February sown carrots that crop from the polytunnels, and they'll crop kind of like late May into June. And then all my carrots for the summer, they all come from the market garden right the way through until September. And then we start cropping field scale carrots in September. And that'll take us all the way through until March, April, depending on what the spring's like, how warm it is. And then that's when the glass house carrots pick up that cycle once again. So I'll come back on to how I use the structures seasonally in a bit. The other thing about maximizing efficient use of space. So again, for me, because it's about, we reckon we supply about 200 families a week, we think. It feels like a sort of, well, we feel about 800 people, about 200 boxes a week is what it feels like from when I was doing my box scheme days. And there's a key thing for me, you know, tomatoes, peppers, like we said, they're not necessarily that profitable. I'm really keen to rip my tomatoes out early every year because I think it's just as important. In fact, it's more important to have loads of really well-established spinaches, salads, and greens than eke my tomatoes out into the back end of November or pick a tomato in Christmas. Someone's like an experienced grower said to me that picking a tomato in Christmas is only good for a grower's ego. It's no good for the bank balance, which I think are quite wise words, actually. In a home garden, it's nice to pick a tomato. There's no way that I'm picking enough tomatoes for 200 boxes in November. So I'm better off ripping the tomatoes out in mid-October and getting straight in there and establishing good crops of greens before the day length gets too short. The other thing about rotations that I find really, really useful is catch cropping. So I've got a picture here, bottom left. So identify and use gaps in space and time. Quite often, if you've got, you suddenly, you know, whether it's a crop failure or you crop something out early, or you end up with it, or it's a mistake in the crop plan, and you've got a gap in space and time, it just appears in front of you. Rotation is great because you just go, right, where am I? Brassica. Okay, catch crop of brassica. Or where am I? Umbilifer, coriander. You know, you don't really have to sit down and work out. It's all there. It's laid out in front of you. The decision's made for you, or the decision what to put in there has been narrowed down to one crop family, ideally. So it's quick to make use of those gaps in space and time. And then the bottom right is long game. So Pete was talking about growing annuals and biennials, and the ecological niche. So the picture here, this is strawberries. We've started producing strawberries in the tunnels almost as an annual. So we plant, the way we do it is the year before we want to crop the strawberries, we're underplanting or interplanting them with beans or tomatoes or calabrese we've done it with, and we'll plant them in the same line. They're a woodland plant. You can literally put them in an almost complete shade and they'll survive. I'm not really interested. We take all the flowers off in the first year and we let them run through into the next year, and then we get a really beautiful early crop of strawberries. We've also been doing these in the strip tillage. So the beans you can see there in that bottom right photo, all of that is about to get undersown with clover. So there'll be essentially clover, strawberries, clover beans, clover strawberries, clover. So again, strawberries take quite a long time. They're in for almost 14 months. They're high value, but I'm also using that as a fertility building part of my protected cropping systems. It's only high value crop, but also fertility building because it is in there for quite a long time. Integrated pest management. Now I've took a lot of lessons from Pete in this over the last 2 years. So a bit of this will be repetition, but it's made a huge difference to my systems. So mature crops are habitats. You know, it's really important to understand that your crops are habitats. At no point are you attempting to keep your crops clean of insects. In fact, it's the opposite. You want as many different insects, as much diversity in there as possible. And there are some quick wins, like Pete said. So almost all of us will grow overwintered brassicas. I use my rotation to build in time to allow them to be there and to flower for a little bit. Same with coriander. If I can't allow them the whole bed to flower, we'll definitely leave the ends and a few plants in the middle of beds and then plant around them. And the key thing about this is in protected cropping, I've been doing some work with Organic Research Centre where I've been questioning for a few years about whether it's a question of having to re-invite in every year predatory insects in the spring into your protected structures, or whether you can get them to overwinter in your protected structures. So we do a lot of stuff within the crops and a lot of annual wildflowers. We've also, in fact, the glasshouse has been up 3 years. The very first thing I planted in that glasshouse was perennial wildflower strips, which you can see bottom left and bottom right. And they're in line with the uprights where we can't crop anyway. So we're now using that line of uprights. We're using it either for peach trees, fan trained, but underneath them we've got perennial wildflowers. And actually within 2 years of planting those perennials, we had lacewings overwintering in the glasshouse. We had loads of ground beetles in those rows. And we did some monitoring in February. So basically there's no insects outside in February. When we monitored the wildflower strips in the glasshouse, they were packed with beneficials all overwintered in different stages of life. Obviously it warms up in the glasshouse much earlier than outside. So I've got ready available predatory insects there way before I'd be able to invite them in from outside. Yeah, if you use green manures, always allow them to flower. You should be able to get green manures to flower in about 6 weeks, clovers and things like that before you work them in. So again, I use rotation to allow for that amount of time. Yeah, perennial habitat where possible. So corners, uprights, anywhere you can get perennial wildflowers and get them in. Rest land. So I mentioned this earlier, you know, we have soil health problems in our glass house. It was 3 years old. It was quite an industrial build process. A lot of very heavyweight scissor lifts being used on the cropping area. We did everything we can. We put green manures in before they built it so that they're driving around on that. We still had shocking compaction. Although I rest land outside lots. I wouldn't naturally rest land inside, but I think we will start bringing in at least a summer's green manure in the glasshouse to try and get some deep rooting crops in, green manure crops in to get down and battle that compaction. Integrating livestock. So I have seen the most fantastic example of a chuck tractor, I think they call it in America, or chicken tractor. And I couldn't believe what it did in a polytunnel. It was a polytunnel where there was rye vetch at about chest height, and the chickens behind the chicken tractor that was going down the polytunnel, that had been turned into, it looked like being power harrowed without anything else. Now, obviously, there are issues around certification and areas for chickens in chuck tractors and things like that. But you can just lock them in the polytunnel, and that would meet all of the certification requirements. And yeah, lots of fertility, but I just don't, and they'll eat wireworm, they'll eat slugs, they'll probably eat some good insects as well, but you have to account for that. But it's a very low fossil fuel way of doing ground preparation. Allow for alternate seasonal uses. So again, I used to do this. I don't do this anymore. I've got enough protected cropping and I've got a dedicated propagation tunnel. But if you don't, you should work into your rotation. There are times a year when you do very little propagation. I mean, I'm growing crops successionally all year round. There's still about 2 months, July and August, where there's very little propagation going on. And if I wanted to, I could probably turn my propagation tunnel over to production. But if you build these times in, you can make best use of the space, and rotation is the best tool for doing that. Curing squash and ripening off squash, lots of people bring them into polytunnels. Quite often, if you don't think about it, you just put them all up and down the pathways, and then you can't actually access your cash crops. You can build into rotation, having a bed spare somewhere to put all your squash down. It just means you can use the polytunnel or the glasshouse much more efficiently. The same applies for onions as well. If you get if it starts raining in mid-August and doesn't stop, ain't no onion that's going to dry outside. So you need to have somewhere, and a polytunnel is the perfect space, lots of sunshine and no rain. So, but you want to build those in intelligently. Don't just think about it when all your spaces are full in August. So crop families, I've actually taken this off my outdoor rotations webinar thing that I do. And I'm not going to read through all this now. I haven't got time, but I've put this on here. So anyone who wants to download or look at this later, basically it's every single crop family, and it's just underneath it. It's just got all their rotational requirements, pros and cons for inside cropping and outside cropping. So it's really important. It's the most important thing for designing rotations, but I can spend an hour on each of these crop families, so I'm not going to do it now. Any questions I can answer afterwards. So starting point for crop planning. So this is my seasonal cycle. So most crops start in the glasshouse, and that production starts at sort of midwinter, early spring. Beetroots, carrots, lettuces, sugar snap peas, they all start in the glasshouse. Many of them then move on to their second crops of the same. So the same crops will do their second production in the polytunnels in spring and early summer. And then most of my harvesting is from the market garden in the summer. And meanwhile, I'm growing all my storage crops in the field scale. And then we come back into the polytunnels for autumn and early winter, and then back into the glasshouse for midwinter. The difference between the polytunnels and the glasshouse, and the reason I use the glasshouse in midwinter, is all about day length and light levels. So polytunnels, there's not much warmth difference for me between the two structures, really. If anything, maybe the polytunnels can be a bit warmer. But once you're into midwinter and you've got very short day length, every single bit of daylight hour is crucial, and glass gives you much higher levels of light. So stuff grows much better in midwinter in the glasshouse. So these are the actual rotations. So in the glasshouse, we go legumes, so various beans for a summer, followed by lettuce for a winter, followed by tomatoes for the next summer. Then we're on to cheddar pods for the winter. Then we're on to cucurbits, so that's early courgettes the following summer, sometimes followed by melons. And then we go into carrots for the winter. And then the following summer it's a mixed bay for that following summer. So it's basil, ginger, and green manures. And then we do winter brassicas, and then we do solanaceae peppers, and then we do cheddar pod beet leaf. And then that goes back. There's 5 bays in the glasshouse. There's a 5-year rotation. And then I might skip this. This is the same as what Pete showed you. So I saw this. This is a cascade. So it shows you everything that's cropping in the glasshouse, and along the top is the months of the year. So that's 5 years along the top. Along the bottoms of the bays, and yeah, this allows me to kind of view it in space and time over a 5-year period. But again, please refer back to that after the presentation. My polytunnel rotations are, we start with strawberries intercropping with a green manure. That's followed by winter brassicas, so that's oriental salads. That's followed by summer of celeries and fennels. Then we're back into winters of leaf beet, summer of legumes, so that'll be sugar snap peas and cobra beans. And then we're into spring greens, bunch turnips, radishes, more spinach in the summer, so that'll be early season tree spinach and leaf beets. And then we go into a winter of umbellifers, so that's corianders and parsleys. And then we go into a summer of cucurbit and sweet corn. So that actually is another great use rotation wise for my tunnel. So that cucurbit and sweet corn is uchikiri squash and sweet corn. They get planted on the same day we plant our squashes and our sweet corn in the field, and they come about 3-4 weeks earlier. So they do a massive season extension on the beginning of the season with sweet corn, which is great. It never quite comes early enough in the summer sweet corn. Then we're into brassicas, then we're into solanaceae, again undersown, and then strawberries and green manures. And then that is the overview of that. Just to say about undersowing, so all of my, in the glass house, all of my summer crops are undersown with clover and trefoil. The technique we use is we do all of those summer crops, so beans, peppers, tomatoes, courgettes, melons, cucumbers. They're all in a central line down the bed, either alternately going up to 2 different wires above the bed, or we grow 2 leaders of one plant. And this is the system designs process. It means we can have all the cables set up above the beds exactly the same. The key thing for me with a single line down the middle of the bed rather than 2 lines is it makes it much, much easier to grow green manures underneath them and manage those green manures properly. And if you manage them properly, it's easy to then relay another crop straight into the same line down the middle of the bed, up the middle of the clover. And looking at the clock, I think I better finish. So that's me done. Thanks, guys.
Thanks very much, Andy. Andy, that's absolutely brilliant. Great. We haven't got many questions yet. If people please put your, must be loads of questions out there. Put them in the Q&A box, and we'll deal with them. There are we do have 1 or 2 to go on with. So first one was from Jane Arnold, and I think you partially answered this, but she asks, when is your first sowing of carrots and what variety? So I think you answered when, which was September.
So yeah, I've just knocked it back this year. So I now go. What I'm trying to do is it's a immovable feast. So I'm trying to just literally guess when my main crop carrots are going to run out in the field, which, you know, it can't depend on how good the crop is. It can be like end of Feb, or it could be like back end of March. We find in the glasshouse, I'm still learning about glasshouse growing. It's a different animal to polytunnels. That if we sow early, and again, this is the problem with this, is depends where you are in the country. I'm on the Cotswolds, so it'll be very different sowing dates from me to Pete, who's growing down near Brighton. It sounds like not very far, but in terms of day length, it's a reasonable amount. So we sow October basically, or I'm looking to sow early October, and that tends to give me bunched carrots kind of back end of March, early April. And then if I sow in the polytunnels, we sow in February, last week of February, and then they will crop end of May, early June.
And varieties?
I just use Nantes, both sides of winter actually. Yeah, I've tried the forcing varieties. I'm not a huge fan.
Okay, thank you. And one from Lawrence Woodward to you, Andy. It was also the same question to Pete, which you answered earlier. But what are your organic matter levels in your protected cropping areas?
Oh, I'd have to look them up, to be honest. They've all been soil tested recently, but I do so many different soil tests I couldn't tell you off the top of my head. The one thing I will say is when I arrived here, the polytunnels had been no dig for quite a while, and things were getting slightly off the scale. So we had phosphate readings of 8 in the tunnels. So actually I pulled out of no dig very quickly after arriving here. The other big reason for us on no dig is we got very high pH, very lime based soil, which in a protected cropping system doesn't match no dig, because lime is dry mortar. So that just glues everything together because you haven't got the acid rain to natural the soils out.
Okay, thank you. There's another question from Jane Arnold to both of you, and it's about calabrese. Is it worth it in tunnels, and when do you plant and crop?
Just quickly, I don't know. I've got a lot of protected cropping. You know, I've got 2,000 meters squared. So we do calabrese because it's my route to market. It's not all about making as much money as possible. It's about having as many different crops as possible. So if I've got empty space available for some reason, I can't just up a profitable crop and make more money from more yield, because there's a certain amount that my customers will buy. So calabrese grows beautifully in polytunnels. Amazing. If you've got the space, do it. But it's quite low down it'd be quite low down my priority list.
Okay, I'll just add something to that before Pete comes in, and that is, I once grew a crop of calabrese in a polytunnel, and the tunnel was left closed over the weekend because it was around the corner, and the person who was filling in over the weekend forgot to open it, and the whole crop got burnt to a cinder, but which is an interesting experience. Anyway, Pete, have you ever grown calabrese and tunnels?
Yeah, when we first turned up at Hankham, we went for it with everything. I mean, as you know, we grew 500 square meters of asparagus, which was a bit of a longer term undertaking than a couple of beds of calabrese. But I'd agree with Andy, it grows amazingly. You can get early crops. As you've just said, middle of the summer is probably not great, mainly because just trying to get the timing right to pick it when it's just perfectly at the sort of beading stage, and then trying to get it in, and 4 o'clock in the morning while it's still cool before it's going to just go yellow within 3 hours. But yeah, midwinter probably pretty pointless. I mean, we did grow purple sprouting one year that was already sprouting by kind of Christmas. It didn't seem to care about going through a cold phase. But yeah, amazing. But just the spacing, it just takes up a lot of space. And when it comes in, the Spanish broccoli is really cheap, and that's actually, when you're running a bot scheme, is a factor. Because if you can be growing spinach, salad, and early fennel and celery and things that are a bit more pricey to buy in, rather than those big nice Eco King boxes of organic broccoli from Spain, we couldn't really compete with what we could get hold of.
Okay, there's a question from Jim Applin on any suggestions for cut flower species to grow over the summer with undersown fertility green manure. We grow zinnias at this time already. Anyone do? Either of you do cut flowers?
Jim, we've just started getting into undersowing cut flower crops. Outside, we're now undersowing. We've undersowed zinnias this year. We've undersowed cosmos this year with green manures. We've undersowed dahlias this year with green manures. So yeah, in the polytunnel, we haven't done the undersowing in the polytunnels, but again, I'm only just learning about polytunnel cut flower growing. We recently put up a polytunnel for cut flowers. Sorry, what was the original question? It was undersowing of cut flowers, wasn't it?
And yeah, any suggestions for cut flower species to grow over the summer with undersown green manure?
I mean, anything tall is what it would be. The simple answer to that. Obviously, smaller things are a little bit. You can't. It's not that you can't use undersowing green manures with smaller crops. It's just a little bit more fiddly, slows down harvest. Got to be a little bit more on it with weeding and stuff like that, I find. But yeah, tall flowers.
Okay, and let's say if anyone on the call has experience of this and wants to pop it in the chat, then do so, and we'll just carry on with the other questions. So yeah, Dennis from Core has asked, it's fascinating about the green manures in the polytunnel. Andy, how do you manage them during the summer? Just cut and mulch or what?
Yeah, cut and mulch. I'm always experimenting. So, I mean, my favorite current tool, and again, this comes back to system design with, so I'm actually rejigging a lot of my bed widths at the moment to allow for this. Up until recently, it's been a little bit hodgepodge how we manage them. Maybe a strimmer, maybe some hedge shears, maybe a hedge cutter. But and a lot of that's to do with not being able to source mowers that are narrow enough to go up and down between a line of tomatoes. That's part of the thing I was talking about by trying to put them all onto a single line down the middle of the bed and grow 2 leaders. So tomatoes, peppers, cucumbers, we do 2 leaders on them. So make best use of vertical 3-dimensional space, but keep the bottom of the plant really neat and narrow. And then actually we can get up and down there with a mower then, which makes it a lot quicker and easier.
Pete, do you want to add to
that? Yeah, so we started off flail mowing, but actually I really like using a scythe. But all of my summer green manures, I didn't get into undersowing. We tended to grow through quite a lot of plastic mulch, and so we had a green manure phase for 3 months of the summer, and so it was much easier to cut it, with anything really. But I quite like using a scythe and then letting the stuff lie down. So basically scythe it just before the weeds seed become viable. So maybe some bits of flowering, and then you just scythe it down, and then the clover always regrows really well. And then last of all, I would then flail it, because the scythe would take down the tallest stuff, and then the flower mower can just finish off. Yeah, that was it really. But I think we did buy a mower that was narrow. It was from a graveyard company that used to mow graveyards, and it was designed to go through the middle of headstones. I actually bought it because I was looking for one to mow between leeks. It was a bit of an impulse buy. We'd lost control of our leeks outside, and so it actually fitted between rows of leeks, and it worked brilliantly for that season. It was like a kind of strimmer in a metal tube. But they're not out there on the open market. It was pretty old and clunky. That's what you need.
Okay, just try and nip through these questions as quickly as possible. The one from Jossie: do you look at fungal bacterial ratio in your soils?
I have done. Early years, I got a bit obsessed with Albrecht system, and then with Elaine Ingham's sort of soil food web stuff. But essentially, I think it's like, well, once you know what you're going to do, and we kind of know what we have to do, so we just do that, and then hopefully it works out. I mean, that's kind of where I ended up. And it's nice to know stuff and look at it, but it didn't always make happy reading. Sometimes they'd be like, oh, you've got problems. And I'd look at the crops and be like, well, they seem okay. So it depends how much fine tuning do you want to do? What's your objective? And if you're trying to produce veg that's better than people are getting elsewhere, that's where we're starting from, really. You want to compete with supermarkets and stuff. And then, where we move on to, we got to think about that as well. But I think that's more specialized stuff. And for local growers who are just really trying to get their heads around rotating crops and building fertility, the fungal bacteria ratio, if you're into it, do it. Don't feel like you have to do it. It may not make any difference. Okay,
Andy, do you want to add, or something?
I would second everything Pete just said, to be honest. I think there's so much to learn. I think the first thing to learn is, if you want to be a commercial grower, the first thing to learn is how to grow a really good lettuce, and then start looking, actually you can kind of grow crops. But I came from a livestock background. I had no horticultural experience at all, discovered a veg farm by mistake, essentially, as a tractor driver. And I learned the mechanics of growing really good crops, literally by numbers: how to plant, how to weed, how to water, how to harvest. I learned all that first, way before I even discovered what soil health was. So it's like Pete says, learn the very basics, and then you refine and get better and better and better and better and better. Don't start off with soil theory. and bury yourself in loads of soil theory books before you even grow a lettuce. I do it the other way around. Trial and error is the best thing.
Okay, back on topic here from Kate and Tony. If you were very short of protected cropping space, how short would you go on a rotation for Solanaceae? Would you stay at 5 years and take the hit, or go closer?
It's a really tricky question. I mean, the first place I worked, they had one tiny polytunnel, and they did tomatoes on one side, cucumbers on the other, and they just switched them every year. And they didn't run into, while I was there, didn't run into too many problems. I mean, obviously we did that for 10 years, you probably run into serious problems. But again, I always find that the answer to that, a lot of the answer to that question is about your route to market and what you need to be producing. You know, do you need to just be producing tomatoes and cucumbers every single year? Or can you take 2 years off growing those and have them? Yeah, it all depends on your route to market.
Okay. And sort of slightly related a bit, follows on from that, or Pete, do you want to answer that? Sorry, did I not go to you?
I would just say, yeah, same as Andy, really.
Yeah.
I think if you, the thing is, it's about prevention. It's like, do you want to keep doing that until you run into problems? And then if you run into problems, are they reversible by extending the rotation? Probably not. Once you hit problems, you've got a problem in your soil and it's difficult to, you know, get out of that. So it's going to be different for everybody, and if you need to grow those crops to stay afloat, you got to do it, you know. So yeah, same sort of thing, really.
Okay, a good, nice, snappy question. If your covered space, from Tim, this is from Tim Dickens, if your covered space is really limited, what 3 crops would you sow in tunnels to fill the hungry gap for a CSA or box scheme?
Sorry, to fill which gap?
The hungry gap.
Ah, okay. Well,
you first,
for me,
Pete.
it would probably be not leafy stuff, because you can do most of that outside in the hungry gap. So it'd probably be carrots, maybe fennel, and yeah, maybe early sugar snap peas or French beans, one of those 2.
Yeah, I would. The key there is it's a bit like the same attitude to agroforestry, which is you want to make best use of 3-dimensional space. So grow some sugar snaps, but grow something underneath them as well. Yeah, and you want to be for hungry gap. You want something going vertical in every bed, and you want something growing on the ground in every bed. And that's the best way of making use of limited space. Funnily enough, maybe just because I'm so hung up on retail at the moment, it's what I supply. I could fill all 2,000 meters squared with spinach and just still not have enough spinach. But that is slightly the difference between a CSA or a box scheme and retail, in that as the grower, you're defining what they're eating with a CSA or a box scheme. Whereas, like I said, with retail, you're reacting. So yeah, no, funny enough, I would say greens. I would go spinaches and beet leaves and chards underneath sugar snaps.
Yeah, I mean, I can second the greens thing, but I just, you know, having a lot of success getting early starts on green leaves outside because of having limited space and because I love growing them. And actually with some crop covers or caterpillar tunnel, you can get a real, you know, the green leaf in hungry gap is not usually a problem in this climate, certainly in the south of England. What the problem is the longer crops that need time to get established. And I think, yeah, sugar snaps and French beans, absolutely.
Yeah, overwintered sugar snaps, a really good one for hungry gaps.
Yeah, I'd also second that on sugar snaps. I think they're a fantastic crop for that time of year, using the vertical space. I think we really need to come to an end there. We've come to, so it's an hour and a half now. So I first of all, I'd like to say a really huge thank you to both our speakers. I think that's been really packed and informative sort of evening, full of practical tips. And please kind of go back and look at the presentations and look at the tables in detail and pore them over and kind of get what you can out of them. The recording will be available. I'll send out the link to everybody that's been on here once we've processed it, and once I've done all the Organic Matters recordings as well, edited those videos, so be busy, but I'll get it down as soon as I can. And the next thing is I've just dropped the link into the chat, just to flag up the next webinar in the series, which will be on the last Wednesday of November, 30th of November, same time, and it's entitled Using Perennials in CSAs and Market Gardens, and that will be about exploring the harvest and resilience and potential of perennial plants as an integral part of a CSA or market garden cropping plan, and that one will be run by the CSA Network UK. We've had some suggestions on here about future webinars. One, whether we could do one on irrigation. We did one. There is a recording of Think available, the one we did previously. But any suggestions you have then of things that you want. Our December slot, we haven't quite decided yet what it's going to be, so it's still up for grabs. And please let us know what you want to see and hear and learn about. So yeah, I'll send an email out shortly once you get the videos up. And thank you all for giving up your Wednesday evenings. I hope you've enjoyed it. And yeah, if you can log out, and we'll see you next time. We'll see you soon. So thank you. And we can stop the recording now, Lizzie.